to have a full range of fantastic speakers. We're going to rattle through the introductions fairly quickly, but I just wanted to ask, we'll just give a few housekeeping guidelines to begin with. East Midlands Council is going to record this session, and the recording will be available after the webinar. So if you feel it's useful, you can access it as a learning resource or share it with colleagues if you feel that would be useful to them. If you want to ask questions, we really encourage you to do that, because we have only a limited amount of time at the end for Q&A. So please do put questions into the chat box, and our panel will attempt to address those and answer those as we go through the session today. And then if there's any recurrent themes, I will pull those together and we can have a conversation with the panel at the end of the presentations. Copies of the slide, as I said, will be on both the East Midlands Council's and the Design Midlands website. I'm just going to very quickly, and as a major housekeeping, if everybody could turn their mic off and turn their camera off unless they are speaking. So we should have one speaker at a time until we get to the Q&A at the end. So if everybody could demute or mute and camera off, that would be terrific. And I'm just going to share presentation. So hopefully everybody can see that now. Just a very quick reminder for those that don't know that Design Midlands, this is our patch. We're one of a number of design network organisations. We work closely with Homes England, and we are building for a healthy life accredited assessors. We do deliver quite a considerable number of PARA 80 design reviews, as well as design reviews on major schemes, greenfield, brownfield housing sites, infill sites, development in sensitive locations. So we've been around for a long time, and this is our website. If you want to go in there and have a look at the services that we offer, we are a charity, and so we're not for profit. So this type of work, providing webinars such as these today, is obviously part of our charitable offer to bring best practice into bring best practice to you. And when we do that through the use of our panel, these are people who are at the top of their profession in terms of architecture, landscape architecture, transport, urban design, the whole range of built environment expertise. And we have our chair, Chris Toomey, here today, is going to give the leading talk today to demonstrate the type of work that we do. We're here to talk about PARA 80. The bit that Design Midlands gets involved with is PARA 80E, the design and supporting local authorities and design teams in understanding if the design meets exceptional quality, if it's truly outstanding and reflects the highest standards in architecture. And we do that quite objectively, and we use a range of panel skills to deal with these questions. Generally, because they are isolated, they're in rural areas. So landscape is very important, but also sustainability, and we'll talk about that during the session today. And enhancement of immediate surrounding, sensitivity to defining characteristics of the local area. For those planners who have dealt with PARA 80, obviously you know how challenging it can be to address these criteria, but the design review panel is there to support that process. Could somebody turn? Oh, thank you. So how we do that, it is sequential. Design review fits within the planning process, and others on the call today will talk about that in more detail. But generally speaking, for PARA 80s, there may be 2, often 3 design reviews having the local authority engage with that process is extremely important. Having the client and their design team is important as well. So it is quite a collaborative process that we undertake, and we choose panel members with the expertise required to suit the scheme in question. So on to the session today. I'm absolutely delighted to have a full range of speakers talking today, who will be trying their level best, as interesting as this subject is, to try and stick to the time allotted to us. As I mentioned, Chris Toomey, who is from Latham's in Derby, is chair of our Midlands Design Review panel. He's going to give the opening talk. And then we have a practitioner, Gillian Mitchell, who will talk about her experiences of bringing a scheme through planning and the design required, the efforts required to bring a design through as a Para 80 scheme. Then Richard Shaw from South Kesteven District Council will be talking about the planning officer's role in that regard. And then we have two inspectors from PINS who will be talking about the appeal process and what criteria they use to deliver that role. And then finally, my colleague Darmista, who manages the design review panel for Design Midlands, will be talking about some tips and give you some guidance on what to look out for, and maybe that could be used by planning officers, a bit of a checklist going forward. So I'm going to stop the show now, my show, and invite Chris to now share his presentation, please.
Thanks, Julie. Lisa, thank you very much. Thank you. Good morning. My name's Chris Toomey. I'm an architect and lucky enough to chair the design review panel on behalf of Design Midlands. I'm going to talk to you about the paragraph 80 from a point of view of the design review panel, so what we see and how we react to those schemes. I think we've probably looked at about over 120 paragraph 80 schemes over the last 4 years or so, and interestingly, probably 30% of those have come back maybe for a second and sometimes even a third review. So there's lots of activity in this area, and it's certainly a growing area of interest. Next, please. I'm going to talk to you about set the scene a little bit about the history of paragraph 80, where it came from, and how we got to it, really. The challenges: it's a very high bar, as you know. The importance of context, the need for a good narrative, and then I'll do a quick sum up. Next, please. Scene setting to begin with. Thank you. Next, please. So it all started in 1997 with PPG 7. John Selwyn Gummer, you might remember, I think was the then Secretary of State for the Environment. And he introduced this, it's often called the Country House Clause or law. So the whole point about it was to promote, exemplary architecture and really allow this tradition of country houses in the open countryside to continue. So it's quite important, and that was the beginning. Next, please. And then since then, there's been a sort of 26-year, quarter of a century history of tweaks and refinements. So if started as Gummer's Law, as it's known, became PPS 7, then with the advent of the National Planning Policy Framework, was enshrined in paragraph 55, slightly different wording each time, then paragraph 79, and now from 2021 it's paragraph 80. Next, please. So paragraph 80, it's bigger than this, but it's really, as Julie said earlier, paragraph 80E that interests us the most. The main paragraph talks about rural worker housing, converting heritage assets, reuse, etc. But we're really focused on 80E. So it's all about promoting design of exceptional quality that's truly outstanding, reflecting the highest standards in architecture. You all know the policy, but interestingly, it still has the second bullet relates to setting and characteristics of the local area, just like Gummer's law in the first place. So the spirit and the intention of the original policy lives on. Next, please. So in preparing for this presentation, I looked around at what might help to support the knowledge and interest in the subject, and I'm aware that Studio Bark have carried out their own research in terms of where paragraph 80 houses, how applications for para 80 houses are, and how they're faring. So I've just lifted this from their website. I'm sure they won't mind, without any. It's just as it is. So they've plotted every application. There's about 219 across the country, and interestingly, there's a very high concentration in Norfolk. Not sure why, but that's how it is. And they're saying that out of the 219 applications, 138 have been approved. They also say through their own research that schemes endorsed by a design review panel, and there are a number of those, tend to be approved 80% of the time. So that's some research they've done, which is of interest to us, I think. Next, please. So turning to the challenges then, there are a number of those. Next slide, please. Yeah, it is an exemption policy, so there is a presumption against development, and the bar is set extremely high. That's the first thing to remember, of course, and so therefore it's up to the design team to make the case as compelling as possible. So I'll talk about what we as a panel think they need to do that. Zero carbon obviously is taken as read in our ever-changing world. That's got to be embedded properly as part of the strategy, and that's the expectation, certainly for a paragraph 80 house. But for clients and landowners, it's a significant opportunity. So they have the opportunity to try and secure planning permission for, a new house where they otherwise would not be able to do that. But it's not without cost and risk. So it's quite a long and costly process, and there's a lot of uncertainty attached to it, even having gone through it in the most rigorous manner. So they, as clients and landowners, need to show an unwavering commitment in the pursuit of great architecture. So it's not really for developers to do on spec, get planning permission and sell on. It tends to be more effective when you've got a committed landowner that actually wants to build their own, legacy house, I guess. And of course, early engagement is absolutely vital with officers, of course, and with ideally with the design review panel. Next, please. So context for us, it's all about design teams demonstrating their understanding of context. So you'll be aware that the policy talks about the importance of setting and the defining characteristics of the local area. Next, please. So we think that it's incumbent on the design team to absolutely understand everything they possibly can about the site, leave no stone unturned. So they need to provide a comprehensive site analysis covering aspect, prospect, topography, ecology, geology, trees, and of course historic map regression and research, and demonstrate that they've got this full understanding of the built and the landscape character. And we think only then can they kind of start to develop their ideas for what that building might be. So it's really it's gathering that understanding and then using that to inform a bespoke contextual design that really couldn't be anywhere else. So it's absolutely, these are one-off houses, no question. Next, please. So how do you capture all that? Well, that's where the narrative comes in, and we think the narrative is absolutely central to the successful passage through planning of a paragraph 80 application. Next, please. So we urge design teams to show the link between what they understand about the site and the place and how they've responded, and ensure that all aspects of the design contribute to the whole, so i.e. it's greater than the sum of its parts. As I mentioned, fully integrate and embed the energy strategy. And critically, every design decision must have a compelling justification. So they can kind of evidence the process of understanding and responding to issues that they've flagged. So really, we're asking them to walk us and you as planning officers, decision makers, walk them through the narrative and tell and sell the story. Next, please. Next, please. So in summary, this is the last slide. We think it's vital that the team is selected with great care. It needs to include all the important disciplines. So, a gifted architect and landscape architect, and all the specialist advisors that might be required. So planning, heritage, for example, depending on the context. So the team is crucial, and it's really a collaborative approach that is required here. Early engagement with the design review panel is definitely of benefit. If you're waiting till the application's been submitted, it's rather difficult to sort of get to a place where your feedback's going to be well received and positive. So ideally, the early involvement is good. Pre-application stage is ideal. And we say to design teams, treat precedent with caution. So we think that images of other things that have happened elsewhere that aren't of the place are useful in discussions with clients in terms of spatial qualities and things that clients may like. But this is all about original thinking. So that's a message that we always hammer home. And as I think I've said earlier, this kind of evidence understanding of place, that has to be clear, and a very clear concept and narrative that's derived from that understanding, and that really means something. So it's all about the place. You remember the policy, the defining characteristics of the local area. So what are you adding to that that's really complementing it? And collaboration, as I said, with officers. Ideally for us at design review, we want the relevant case officers in the room on the day, so that we can run the review as a sort of open and transparent collaborative review. So we get all the views aired in the room on the day. We don't have a sort of private session afterwards where we think of things that we haven't said to the design team and the landowner and the client. So if we can do that with the local authorities, then that works really well for us. Last one. Sorry, I did say that was the last one. Thank you. So paragraph 80, it exists to promote exemplary design and great architecture. You might say it's a shame there aren't other policies like that in respect of other building types. But essentially, paragraph 80 houses, one likes to think that these may well become the listed buildings of tomorrow. So thank you.
Thank you, Chris. If you could, thank you very much. Now I'll invite Gillian, please, to do her presentation. Thanks, Gillian. If you unmute.
Good morning.
Thank you.
Good morning. Since I'm a tech dinosaur, can you see my first slide?
Sure can.
Great, thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to start off by saying I have not seen Chris's presentation, and I'm glad I can say that because I'm more or less going to say what he's just said, except I'm going to apply it to two projects where we've had success with paragraph 80. And it's quite heartening actually to revisit the processes that we went through and to see that they are a very logical, rational and sequential process. There's a lot of subjectivity around quality, but there's also a lot of objectivity. And I think it's really important to understand how judging high quality is not simply a matter of taste. and it's a really difficult thing to define, but it's a really important area. So I run a practice in Derbyshire. We specialise in low energy projects, particularly private residential projects. We do some private commercial projects. We have had 2 paragraph 80 projects, both of which were unanimously approved at first outing to committee. That is not statistically enough to say that we've got the process right, but it's good enough for me, and the next one we'll probably follow the same process. If it's worked twice, I'm going to keep going till somebody says no. Okay, so what I need to do now is to find out how to change slides. There we go. The best chance of success, in my opinion, is pretty much what Chris has just summarised, which is a thorough understanding of planning policies, criteria and precedent, and that's our planning consultant, who understands and continually researches paragraph 80 projects around the country and understands what's been judged, how it's been judged, what sort of criteria are being applied, and understands what local planning authorities are looking at when they're making a decision, and what the inspectors are doing too. The right design team is critical. We put our clients at the heart of the design team. We occasionally push them to one side and say, just be patient, we've got a bit of design work to do, but they are absolutely critical to what we do. Thorough design process, and by thorough I mean lengthy, very, very deep and relatively expensive, and then tested with external scrutiny. And in our case, on both projects, we used the design review panel process. Engagement with LPA, if you can. I appreciate that a lot of authorities are pushed and either can't or choose not to engage. We had 2 different local authorities in our projects, and we had 2 very different approaches from them, which I'll mention very briefly later on. And then a really strong, high quality planning submission where quality, not quantity, counts. Our planning consultant used to be a planning officer, senior planning officer, and she has always said to me, I present my applications the way I'd like to have received them, which is make my life as easy as possible to say yes. And that's kind of the approach we take, was what do we need to do? How do we need to actually logically and sequentially express what we're doing in this project to get the outcome that we need, or to help the local authority understand the outcome we need? Our first success was this project. This is a digital image which we used at planning committee. It was on a sloping paddock overlooking a reservoir. It wasn't completely isolated, but it was deemed isolated in planning terms. There was a farmhouse next door, but the lane led only to a farm and nowhere else. So it wasn't a through route. And our very simple brief, and the brief is usually very simple in these projects, which is how many bedrooms do you want and how do you like to live? But to be fair, that applies to every project. But we had enlightened clients who I discovered after we'd finished and got planning approval, whose son is an architect in London, who didn't want to work with his parents. He works in a very different arena. And at no point did we ever hear the words, our son thinks you should change this. But it didn't explain why they were so open to some of the language we were using and the approach we were taking, because it was obviously something they were familiar with. So this project, I'm not going to go through the design of this at all, but it was a dream of a site because the contours went across the land, which enabled us to create a 2-storey house, but each of those floors was level. So it's a very accessible property, and there was a progression across the site, and it's very complex, and I won't go through a lot of the design. And I should start off by saying, of course, it doesn't matter if you don't like these. We got approval and therefore did our jobs. But I appreciate that you're not all going to like what you see. But the second project is one I'm going to actually use. This is much more recent. And for those of you who choose to watch Grand Designs, it was on last September. If you're going to do a project like this, don't do it on national television. That's my advice to anybody. So our second success was on an 18-acre small holding in Derbyshire. Again, a rural lane leading to one property, no through route. And again, a very enlightened and engaged client. The clients found us because they saw the previous project and said, we want one of those, but we want more land. And then the next time I saw them, they bought the site, handed me the brochure and said, get us planning approval on this land. And you sort of go, okay, I'll have a go, because they'd already bought the land. Very simple brief, 3 bedrooms plus 2, all about multi-generational living, having their children and their parents coming and going as required, and flexibility so that in the future they can also be on the property when perhaps one of their daughters takes over the reins. They keep rare breed sheep, they have bees, they will have hens. They're refusing to have alpacas, although I keep trying to suggest that they should. And energy efficiency was key. I'm not really going to talk about sustainability today. I think it's a given. I think it's talked about a lot elsewhere, but it was very key to our design, except our design could never be passive house, because in order to get paragraph 80, we had to design it to suit the site. And one of Chris's comments resonates with me very strongly, which is we always say, could this property be built anywhere else in the world? And the answer has to be no, otherwise we haven't quite done our job right. So that where we ask our clients to step aside in design terms is usually because we're responding to the site, not necessarily to their taste, although it's obviously very important, since they're paying for it, that they get what they want as well. Just going back to those earlier requirements, a couple of thoughts. I mentioned about our planning consultant being very clear and very well versed in paragraph 80. I think that's really important. And what usually happens is when one of us gets an inquiry, we will both go and visit the client and the site. And in that visit, we're making a huge amount of assessment. And about 90% of it is scientific, which is planning policies in the area. Is it actually a paragraph 80 site? Is it isolated? But 10% of it is gut feel. We walk around and using our long experience saying, does this feel like this is the right project? And part of that is assessing the client, because a lot of people, we've turned down so many approaches because they just simply are not something that we would take on board. We never say you'll never get planning. We always say it's not one that we will take with you to the planning process. And you usually start off with the client saying, the field has been in the family for years, we want to have a go, or it's worth a punt. And those are the first two sentences where we walk away and say, no, this is not for us. Sometimes people have got wise to that and are saying, oh, well, there's a long legacy of whatever, and it's usually something family based, and you think it's a bit tenuous, think you're trying it on, really not sure. But we will always test out a site assessment to see if we think that is a project that we think we could make work. But as I said, we turn down so many. The final thing we do with our clients is not trying to scare them, but we do tell them how much it's going to cost to get a project to planning application stage with no guarantee of success. And I can't tell you what our clients have spent because I actually don't know, but I think it's in the region of 80 or 90,000 pounds to get to a planning application stage. And that weeds out people who are just trying it on because they are not going to risk that amount of money. You have to really be committed as a client. That there are risk checkpoints along the way. You're very rarely going to get to the full spend and submitting an application without having some reducing the risk. There is always a risk. Planning is outside our control, no matter how much as architects we think we like to control the process. We know we don't. So the client, the evaluation of the client is really important. And that's why I say they're central to the design team, because we've already made sure that they really understand what they're getting into. Then we will look to see who the design team needs to be, and inevitably there will be a landscape architect. Our two schemes were landscape led, and that landscape analysis of both sites was really key to getting approval. Thorough design process, tested with external scrutiny. We used the design review process to the point of, not to the point of exploitation, but we saw it as part of our design team. We welcomed the input from neutral, fresh pairs of eyes. And it was really important and really useful for us to get people who were professional and well-informed, very highly qualified, and very familiar with the process around the table, helping us to make it the best scheme we possibly could. In both projects, we had two full design review panels, one at an early stage, just post-concept. Are we going in the right direction? Have we made the right assessment? And that's one of our clients' risk points, where we say, at this point, you can stop. If we get feedback from the review panel that says, you've kind of got this completely wrong, that's the point at which we would say we stop. We can't, or completely change approach. Fortunately, that didn't happen. And then in one of our projects, we had a final interaction with the design review panel through the local planning authority, who commissioned a desktop report of the submission to make sure that we had dotted the I's, crossed the T's, and got it across the line. Engagement with local planning authority, if you can. In our first approval, we had a local authority who had a design champion. He was not a case officer, he's not a planning officer, but he sat with the planning team and helped them to navigate the whole issue about design quality. He did it for all the schemes, all the major schemes. He sat in on the design review panels, and he fed back to the planning team. So they had some assessment on the quality side that gave them a bit of comfort. In our second project, we had a limited engagement from the local authority. We had the head of planning who attended the first review panel at concept stage, chose not to come to the second review panel, but then completely engaged once we got to pre-app stage. And we engaged the pre-app process because they hadn't been at the review panel, because we couldn't submit an application without the planning authority knowing what's going to land on their desk and why it was there. And we weren't entirely sure they would engage fully with the pre-app process. I know it varies from authority to authority. Some don't have any approach through pre-app, some have quite rigorous systems. Fortunately, in this case, we managed to invite them to the site where, as I kept telling them, there's a one-to-one model outside of the site, and here are some images showing you what you're going to get on it. We had a very large physical model, we had a 3D fly-through, and we'd printed images off the fly-through and got them to stand at points on the site with the fly-through picture in front of them and say, that's what you'll see when you're standing here. And when they realised we'd modelled the actual trees on site, I think they got some comfort that we weren't trying to sort of fudge it and make it look like it was something it wasn't. They realised this is actually what we're going to get. And I think that really helped them when it came to the point. But I do understand it's an investment from a local planning authority side, and that isn't always forthcoming or supported. And therefore, we've got to try and work with that however we can through the process. Looking at the thorough design process, I'm going to show you some slides. I apologise, these aren't fantastic. It doesn't really matter. It'll just talk you through some of the processes we went through. So on that second approval, the top left sketch was actually a spatial diagram coming out of a bubble diagram. Blue is the public facing accommodation around a farmyard. Pink is the private accommodation facing over the valley. And at every drawing stage, we had pink and blue up until one of the design reviews, which I will talk about in a little moment. That evolved into looking at how the building sat on the site, whether it was actually a straight line or a cranked form to follow a hedgerow line. And if you can see the dashed line with the hatching behind are the existing buildings that were there on the site. As a result of our second design review panel, we decided to keep the barns on the south of the site and to remove the rest, whereas initially we'd assumed we'd be taking everything out. So the retained barns, this is the final layout when we got to design free stage with retained barns. We still had this public facing yard out onto the lane, and we had a private facing, and still a division between the two, which as I said, we got to the point where at design review stage we were able to alter that. And if I, oh, something's gone funny. I'm not sure I can actually see. Oh, I can. Great, technology is working. This one, which was just done. So this one is when we were presenting our information at the design review panels. So our first image was the landscape plan with our building plan on top. We had a cranked form. As a result of the feedback from the review panel, we altered the design. We still had a cranked form at that point. And this little white line is actually a wall that divided the private and public space. We amended our designs and presented something slightly different at our second design review, and then evolved it into the submission that we actually made to the planning authority. The significance of this line in the second design review was a really interesting interaction with the design review panel experts. We had favoured having some sort of shielding device, keeping the privacy, so that on the private side it wasn't available. There was a public footpath up the lane, so there were people going to be regularly walking up and down the lane. And we debated this with the design review panel, and they said it feels like it's a barrier and it's an exclusion and it's a division, whereas we think it should be something that's much more inclusive. And what we ended up with, which you probably can't see on this slide, but it's almost like a Z-shaped circulation pattern, which takes you from the productive garden on the upper paddock down stairs inside the building, across the yard and down to the orchard and fruit cages on the lower field. And this became an actual, it's a physical route, and it's also a very important linkage across the function. So instead of it becoming some sort of divisive mode, it actually became something that became quite inclusive. And there are 2 stairs in the house, and the working stair, as it's always been called, is galvanized steel. It is very robust, and it is there. If you walk down in your muddy boots, you don't get shouted at. It's there to be cleaned and to be used. So the design review process was really important to us in our design evolution, and it also helped us to tell the story when we got to making our submission. And our planning submission, this is the contents page, we presented our workbook, as we called it, which I suppose is a combination of a planning statement and a design and access statement, if you will. We presented at A3, it was very visual. Quality is key. There were 138 pages in it, but there was nothing in there that couldn't have been taken out because we did a heavy edit. And we went through telling the story as if we were talking to a planning officer for the very first time, saying, this is where we started from, here are the policies, here's the client's story, here's how we did our site analysis. And then somebody got their microphone on.
Yeah, sorry, could somebody turn their microphone off? We're talking over Gillian.
Thanks, Julie. Thank you. So we structured the document the way we would approach talking to the planning team, and the way we used it at pre-app, in fact, and the way in which we would have expressed it at planning committee had we been required to go through in that much detail. And therefore the client's voice was heard in virtually every chapter. There's a very big section on site analysis, which was deep and wide. Then we took the design development. Then we took the materials palettes, and we had a structural engineering involved. The project, if I can go back to this slide, the project is barn-like in its massing and volume, in that an agricultural barn has a steel frame and is clad with whatever's required to suit the purpose inside. So it could be block work if you're keeping animals and you don't want cladding to get damaged at a low level. It could be corrugated lightweight cladding at a higher level to keep your animal feed dry, or it could be hit and miss timber to provide some solar shading. And that's pretty much the model that we took. And because of the steel frame, we wanted to assess that at a planning stage to prove the concept. And so our engineer was able to come up with some diagrammatic proof of concept, which we included in our workbook, so the planners could see it was a very full and very well considered design. If we were to take on another one, because I keep saying we've been approached quite a lot, we would follow exactly the same process. It's very logical, it's very rational, it's very sequential. We would try very hard, and perhaps with a little bit more confidence, to ask the local planning authority to engage, completely understand why that may or may not take place. But the more that we can make your job easier to understand the scheme and to understand the depth of work that's gone in behind it, the more helpful I think it is to be able to make what we consider to be a good decision, which in our case is usually this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gillian. That was terrific. Thank you. And it's so lovely to hear about the process from your side as well, obviously, because we were on the other side, weren't we, at the time? So hand over to Richard now, and Gillian, you can unshare. Thank you very much, Richard.
That's fine.
Thank you, Gillian. Hopefully you can see that now. Just double check.
Yes, perfect.
Yep, great, thank you. Yeah, hi there. Yep, I'm Richard Shaw. I'm the Principal Design Officer at South Kesteven District Council, and also one day a week at Rutland County Council. Been working as a design officer for probably about 15 years or so. Formerly also at South Derbyshire District Council. I've dealt with a fair number of paragraph 80 houses over the time. So I'm going to today give a local authority perspective of how local authorities experience these types of applications. So yeah, just what I'm going to talk through today. Starting off with some common issues that local planning authorities experience. And then I'm going to break down the actual paragraph 80 policy a little bit and sort of look at that. I'm going to give some advice for local planning officers based on the schemes that I've dealt with over the time. Some advice for applicants working with the local planning authority as well. But that is also the types of things that local planning officers should be sort of demanding off applicants as well. And then finally, I'm going to sort of wrap up with some conclusions. So yeah, so starting off with the 5 common issues. The first one, I think local authorities can have a low confidence in making a judgment on these types of applications. It's a very high bar, and it's trying to have the confidence to state or decide whether a building is outstanding or not. So that can be an issue. And then linked in with that is in-house skills. There can be a feeling that they don't have the right skills in architecture or landscape to make that call. But I'm going to come on to this later. There is some of that skill is perceived, and I think local planning authorities and officers can probably do more in terms of sort of objectively assessing things. I'll come on to that, and not necessarily need to be an expert architect or qualified architect to make some decisions about a particular application. In terms of fees, it's a relatively low planning application fee for a single dwelling, but in terms of time and resources, is very high. So there's a little bit of an imbalance there, particularly with the way that councils are run these days in terms of income generation. So there's a bit of an imbalance there. So that can be an issue. Use of design review panels, really helpful. And I'll mention this a few times throughout the presentation, but really good. But the local planning authority is often tasked with deciding at what stage to take it to design review and sort of advising the developer on that. And that can be, if you go in too early with not much information, it can be not as much of a meaningful session. But if you go in too late with a more finished design, then that's not helpful either. So it's hitting it at the right stage. They have to, local planning officers have to make that call. And then also how to use the advice once you receive the comments and the letter. It's quite often the local planning authority is tasked with negotiating the contents of that with the developer, and that can be challenging sometimes as well. And then finally, the fifth one is dealing with the final sort of hurdle, really, is members at committee and convincing members that this is if you're taking it for approval, that this is a good scheme, and particularly with sort of contemporary architecture in very sensitive locations, it can be a challenge to get it to convince members that this is good enough to approve. So picked out 5 issues there. So yeah, just delving into the policy application now. The first hurdle is to assess whether it's isolated or not. I'm not going to go into great detail on that because I think later on today, Pins are going to sort of touch upon that issue, maybe give a bit more clarity about it, but that can be the first decision that's made, and it can be challenging. If it's concluded that it's not isolated, then you do often refer to paragraph 134, which has slight, a number of differences and similarities to paragraph 80. One of the differences, it's outstanding or innovative. It picks upon sustainability, particularly, it mentions that, but it also alludes to fitting in with the context. As was said before, we're going to focus on paragraph 80E. So just looking at breaking the policy down, paragraph 80 down, I've split it into 4 here. So truly outstanding, the highest standards in architecture, raising standards of design more generally in rural areas, significantly enhance its immediate setting, and sensitive to defining characteristics of the local area. Going to look at each one of those in turn just briefly. So this can be challenging for local planning authorities, deciding whether this building in front of them is truly outstanding. But what I'm going to say here, and I'll come on to this later as well, is that there's certain components of a building that you can look at objectively in order to assess it, and it's not just looking at what it looks like and making a judgment on is that building outstanding based on what it looks like. So I've a useful resource here is the REBA Awards judging criteria, and that lists, I've sort of slimmed it down there, but there's quite a long list of things there, and it's quite a wide range of things you're looking at when you're assessing a building. You've got the design vision, there's innovation and originality, engagement of occupants and visitors, accessibility and sustainability, being fit for purpose, and then client satisfaction that has been mentioned quite a bit before. So that's really useful to look at that, and it's not just about how it looks. So the second one, I think this is the most vague part of the policy, and I think actually it more neatly fits with the previous one I've just gone through, because it requires a knowledge of what the design standards are in rural areas to begin with, if you're going to raise them. It does relate to that architectural standards in the previous one I mentioned, but it could potentially include landscape. Significantly enhance its immediate setting. I think this is quite strongly phrased, so you've got significantly in there. You are dealing with a landscape setting predominantly for these types of developments, requires a comprehensive understanding of the setting, but it also relates to the quality of the setting. If you're going to significantly enhance it, the baseline of what that setting is like to begin with is relevant. Then it also needs demonstrating that you are significantly enhancing it. And I think, again, local planning authorities struggle with this, and members. If you've got a stunningly beautiful piece of countryside, and you're going to place a building in that setting, sometimes there's a public footpath running by it as well, and it can be hard to convince a local planning authority and the members that actually this building is going to enhance that setting if it's already classed as sort of stunningly beautiful. So that it is a challenge to convince local planning authorities of that. And then finally, this is probably one of the most clear-cut aspects of the policy, is making sure it's sensitive to the defining characteristics of the local area, and that obviously requires a really in-depth study of the local area, really deep understanding of it, and a really kind of delicately aware response by the architect and developer. Again, it's that evidence. I'm going to come on to providing evidence about to back up these comments. So yeah, so I've put together some advice for local planning authority officers. First of all, I guess have confidence. It's not all about being an expert in architecture or landscape. There's some things you can look at objectively and actually go through the policy and assess them. So yeah, get involved, go and visit the site, fully understand it yourself, go around the nearest settlements, look at the materials, sort of arm yourself with a really deep understanding as well of the area. And then once you start looking at the policy and whether the application meets it, break it down, probably into those three, linking them, my first two together, break it down into three. And then there was an article in the Planner earlier this year talking about this objective assessment, that it said every part of the design process can be looked at objectively. The paragraph 80 test simply demand a design process that demonstrates sensitivity to a site's defining character. So yeah, there's a lot a planning officer can do to break everything down and look at it without being a qualified architect or qualified landscape architect. This has been mentioned before, but the design process is really essential. And you know, local planning authorities need to be demanding this from applicants, and if it's not there, if the site analysis isn't done, if the response to context isn't done, kind of need to be sending them back a few steps. And yeah, use design review services, really helpful. But it's worth noting that they're not the decision maker. The local planning authority is the decision maker. So you still need to put together your own arguments using design review input. But the design review panel aren't rubber stamping the scheme to say it's approve it. So this is focusing on the design process. This is a extract from our design SPD at Rutland and South Kesteven, and basically saying that things should be done in this order. So, you know, understanding the context first, responding to the context is a really important stage that's often missed, and then looking at starting to develop concepts for the scheme, and then finally sort of more detailed design. Quite often people come in too early with the detailed design, so it's a case of sending people back to the beginning and then making people do that in that order, and also trying to avoid retrospectively doing the early bits once the detailed design's done. We quite often get that, and that's not the best way to approach it. Also, just to mention that this is all backed up now with the National Design Guide. The first two sections on context and identity have some really useful advice, and also some prompts about what to look out for when you're doing a site and contextual analysis. So looking at this evidence that you should be demanding really in order to assess it, it should be compelling, you know, undisputable, it should be really well researched, should be comprehensive, should be sensitive, detailed and clearly illustrated. And the illustrations on the right, the black and white ones in the middle, it was just an extract from a design and access statement, and it was helpful because these, at this scale, you can't see necessarily, but these document three versions of a particular elevation as it was changed over time. And it really clearly illustrates the improvements made to that particular elevation. So it helps tell that story of how things have evolved. And the response to context stage is really essential. I'm just going to focus on that in a little bit more detail. So this is just a diagram that shows, it's particularly focusing on the edges of a development site for a paragraph 80 house. And there's a narrative there in the text to talk about and to sort of analyze and explain those edges and talk about how they might be responded to. And you've got the whole wider settlement there and wider area and key views, and you've got contours. So it's really helpful to have these diagrams. This one, the same site, but it's focusing in a little bit more detail now. And again, that narrative is there in those bits of text around the edge, and it's sort of really explaining why and giving the reasons why, and it's really helpful to have that. This was a scheme we had in South Derbyshire, and this successfully responded to context. It went through design review a few times. It was approved, and then as a planning department, we also visited this once it was completed. So it was a good example. But yeah, so this is an interesting one because it cantilevers over an existing hedgerow. The rear of the building that you can't see terminated a view down a sort of rural track, rural lane, and it was that elevation of the building was treated completely differently to this one you can see now, which is the one with a view out over a reservoir. So this, yeah, it's an example of one that did respond to context really well. Just some extracts from design and access statements. On the left, they've got a hard work strategy, looking at some of the surface materials in the nearby settlement and looking at the geology as well, and then applying that to the particular scheme. So they're responding really well with those materials. And on the right hand side, they've observed that around the site there's grasslands, and they're kind of bringing in to the landscaping plans areas of grassland to respond to that. So they were good examples of how response to context being done well, and also how it's been really clearly illustrated as well, because that's half of the challenge as well, is making it crystal clear so that officers can assess this. This is just an example of something not so good. It's an example where response to context was missed out. So we just had a statement about the nature of the site, saying there's a minimalist approach to landscape, refer to the landscape scheme, and same with materials, saying the careful consideration was given to materials, but look at the submitted drawings, but there was no explanation why those particular materials and landscape proposals were made, and that's the essential stage. So yeah, just picking up on a few common issues that come up with these types of schemes. One of them is the location of the dwelling on the site. That's a really key first decision to be made. You can see the diagram here. They're exploring 3 options, and in that design and access statement, they did actually give a little bit of a assessment of each one of those options and the pros and cons of it, and that was really helpful to have that. So as a local planning authority, you could be confident that the right position on the site has been chosen, and that was all detailed out. So that was really helpful, and that this is a common sort of starting point. Quite often the location of the access is another key thing to look at. Quite often highways are involved in that, but also the journey to the dwellings. Quite often the accesses are quite long to get to the building, and there can be an interesting journey to get to the dwelling. That comes up quite a lot. Transitions is a really important element. Various transitions, you're transitioning from the inside of the building to the outside. You've quite often got a kind of a formal or more domestic garden area outside, but then also how that domestic area transitions to the wider site land. Quite a lot of these schemes have got acres of land in ownership of the applicant around, and you do need to transition sensitively from the domestic garden to the wider landscape, and then once you get out of the ownership, you've got there's the rural countryside as well. So having really sensitive transitions is really important, and what you want to avoid is having sort of garden paraphernalia and mown grass and spilling out into or being very visible from public areas where sort of in a not very subtle way. So it really needs sort of sensitively knitting into the landscape setting that you're looking at. So that's important. And then finally, visibility of the dwelling. It can be an issue. There can be some, particularly maybe from members planning committee, there can be a feeling that we don't want to see the building. We can be a tendency to think it needs hiding, but that's not the case. I don't think. I think we need to appreciate and understand that it's okay to see it if that's part of the vision for it. We don't have to hide it away, and that's down to what I was saying before. Really, is sort of really sensitively knitting it into the landscape. But just acknowledging that it's okay to see it and not being kind of scared of it being visible. So just some points for the applicants working with the local planning authority, but this is also what local planning authority officers could expect. So engage early, that's been covered before, but having a really good working relationship with the local planning authority is really important. Maybe a joint site visit. Visiting the site together can be really, really helpful. This has been mentioned before, but having a design team, the applicant should have a landscape architect in from the very beginning. We have had some applications where it's just been an architect, and that has limited the project and caused a few issues. So yeah, get that really good design team. Follow the design process I've talked about before, and avoid coming in with any detailed designs too early. Use design review, but also be flexible. Obviously, you don't want to be going in there with a fixed mindset, so you need to be going in there being open and flexible. Using 3D visuals is really helpful, both for planning officers to assess it, to communicate it, but also at planning committee. With a couple of images, you can communicate a lot. And then in terms of planning committee, as I said before, it can be a very controversial thing for them to assess. They can be very wary of these types of applications. So there are often opportunities to give a briefing to planning committee a few weeks before, and that can be a really helpful way of going into things in more detail, rather than waiting for the day of planning committee to try and communicate everything. So this is just some examples from design and access statements, sort of where they've told the story. You can see there's showing you working out, really. This is showing your thought processes, sort of very sketchy diagrams, and you could see, and it's really helpful as a planning authority to be able to see this sort of workings out. There's just a quote here about how the design team was chosen, and the fact that landscape designers were very much a key part of that. Again, there's some more sort of sketches here, sort of telling the story, showing how everything's evolved. And then another quote about the building being of the land, not on the land, and saying that the landscape plays an equally dominant role. It's important for us to consider them equally and simultaneously. And this is just showing some more sort of sketches to help communicate the scheme, which is really useful. And then the accurate visual representation images are really helpful, sort of with photorealistic setting the building in that. And this was the scheme that I talked about from South Derbyshire. This is the country lane that it terminates the view down, and they went for a very much agricultural appearance of the building from that side, with limited glazing, to address that view and that setting. But in this image communicates that really clearly. And this is the same building, but viewed from a public right of way further down the hill. And this particular one is actually a 15-year view to show how the landscape might have matured after 15 years. There was also a 1-year view, and that's really helpful as well. So yeah, so finally, just some conclusions to sort of bring that all together. So, you know, for planning officers and developers, break the paragraph 80 down into 3 and address those. For developers, address that in your design and access statement, really thoroughly address each of those elements of the policy. And for the local planning authority, you know, break the policy down and look at those different elements. So specifically for the developer, put together a really multidisciplinary design team, follow and clearly illustrate the design process. Helps greatly and for the local planning authority to assess it. For the local planning authority, yeah, as I said before, have confidence you can objectively assess quite a lot of the elements of this paragraph 80. So do as much as you can, but then also use design review for expert input and additional support. But don't necessarily solely rely on that input, because you do need to make the call yourself at the end of the day. And at South Kesteven and Rutland, I am in the process of developing a bit of a paragraph 80 kind of an assessment or a prompt sheet, covering some of the things I've talked about today, just to really helpfully break the policy down, make sure the design process is followed, and give prompts so that they can be assessed consistently and also effectively. So that's something quite exciting I'm hoping to put together. Yeah, and that concludes my presentation.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Richard. It's been really thorough and really, really useful, I hope, for the audience today. So I'm going to invite John from PINS and his colleague Glenn to come in now and talk about their role. If anybody has any questions to raise, I'm just a reminder to stick these in the chat. But hopefully people won't be minding too much that we're running over slightly today. Thanks.
Thanks, Julie, and thanks for inviting us along today. People say that inspectors should get out more, so here we are. My name's Glenn Rawlings, and I'm joined today by John Longmuir. We both have experience in these types of appeals and deal with them regularly. I should say that the information that we're going to impart today is based on our own experience, and it's not guaranteed to be the same as PINS. John's going to, he's our policy expert. He's going to talk about the policy side of things. We're going to focus on 80E, but I will come back with a little bit more about isolation and what that means in terms of the Braintree judgment, how we deal with it after that. So thanks very much, John.
Thanks, Glenn. Lisa, can I have the next slide, please? So how do inspectors work? Well, that's probably quite a burning question for most of you. Our starting point is to take a policy, the critical policy, in this case, paragraph 80 and D, and an inspector will take a highlighter pen and pick out the critical words. So in other words, the dialogue words are left out, and the inspector will extrapolate those criteria. You'll quite often see those left as a subheading or as a heading in a decision notice. Other inspectors might take those out, but those words will be used and quoted in a decision. And in particular, the end of an inspector's conclusion on that specific point will make reference to the policy or paragraph in the framework, and you'll get words along the lines of the proposal accords with paragraph 80E insofar as it is an exceptional quality, truly outstanding, reflecting the highest standard of architecture. So basically, the inspector is quoting those keywords back. And the reason for doing that approach is so we are then seen by everyone to be directly applying the criteria in those policies. And I'd suggest that goes for any local authority officer in any committee report or any standard approach. So that's those keywords that we've highlighted there, you should address in your approaches to this. So next slide, Lisa, thank you. So there's reference in the framework that in paragraph 3 that it should be read as a whole, and that's quite often quoted in development plan policies, but it's also relevant to the framework as a whole. So whilst we focused on ATE, we shouldn't disregard other policies, and reference has been made already this morning about the energy efficiency and of these sorts of dwellings, and that comes from other policies. Paragraph 126 is particularly relevant as well, because that's talking about high quality, beautiful and sustainable buildings, and that word beautiful has come in and arguably has raised the bar quite considerably. There's also a reference to good design there as well. Again, I've highlighted that, and there's reference in there to sustainable development, really, and these are things to pick out. The next slide, please, Lisa. So also highly relevant is paragraph 130. Again, I've highlighted some of the key words there that I'd pick out in any decision I had to make. So we've got there visually attractive as a result of good architecture. So those are key words that I would be quoting back. And other words here again highlighted in paragraph 130 are sympathetic to local character and history. Now, that history might be lost, ignored at times, but Chris made a very good opening point this morning when he referred to understanding context and referring to regression maps. And those are very helpful, particularly in any heritage cases that show settlement patterns, field boundaries, really helpful to local understanding. There's words at the end of that criterion C, discouraging appropriate innovation or change. So I think sometimes there's a concern that if we do consider local context, it's always going to constrain the designer into a pastiche approach, but that's not necessarily the case, because that words in paragraph 130 do not discourage appropriate innovation. So there's a license here that you can have that sort of innovation, and it's not necessarily a pastiche country house. Next slide, please, Lisa. So looking at the rest of paragraph 130, there is reference to this strong sense of place. I know those words are frequently misused, misinterpreted, but as designers, they are a key word, and that's the sort of summary of how the design's going to work in context and what sort of character, what sort of feeling it's going to create. So a good keyword that's often misused. Next slide, please, Lisa. So hopefully that will come up. Lisa, is that, yeah, here we go. Right. Okay, so there's taking that as a whole is quite critical that there's a need to consider the site's immediate setting. Now that's in terms of the extent of the setting, And as a designer putting in a scheme, you may well have to define what that extent of setting is. That's quite common approach with listed buildings, but it's also common here. So you've got to define what is the extent of the setting, and you've got to, as Richard made the point, and I wrote it like a true inspector. I wrote his words down, an in-depth study of the local area. Well, that's exactly right. And I wonder if there's some inspiration to be taken from a certain Lancelot Brown in the 18th century, who considered that a site might have capability. Well, that's exactly the approach here. There's also a need to understand the vernacular, not necessarily be slavish to it. Gillian referred earlier to the way she used the farmyard and barnyard style. Well, that's exactly right. So note what the vernacular is and then consider how to use it. The next slide, please, Lisa. So taken together, 126 and 130 require a good design. So if the basic ground rules for any application or any appeal scheme are that it's good design, by its nature, paragraph 80 schemes must be exceptional because they're hard on that baseline. Next slide, please, Lisa. So Chris mentioned this morning that we should be looking at potentially listed buildings for tomorrow. So paragraph 30 refers to the longer term appearance. Now, we all know that some materials can weather. Sometimes those may be a positive weathering. Sometimes they might be a negative weathering. But that's one example of how you need to look at the longer term appearance. Similarly, the landscape surrounding a site may change, context is changed, and in any heritage cases, that's referred to in Historic England guidance. There's also a concern about whether a certain style is going to look dated or not, and to some extent that might relate to how innovative and how well the site, the design responds to the site. So that's something to not ignore at all. Next slide, please, Lisa. So finally, there's a need for some contextual analysis, and that contextual analysis should pick up every aspect of context. And Richard made reference to the National Design Guide, and there's some very, very good and comprehensive criteria there into understanding context and setting. And I'd suggest that it's well worth making reference to those. So over to my colleague, Glenn, who's going to talk about more of these sorts of policy approaches in action.
Thanks very much, John. We really like these sorts of appeals because we don't get too many of them. And John and I both have a design background, so we do deal with them. They tend to be allocated to inspectors with a design background. We have a small number of landscape architects and urban designers. So you may see the same names coming up again and again in the decision letter. But we are objective. Part of that assessment process is a site visit, and it reminds me of the old joke, what's an urban designer's favourite 3 words? Context, context, context. Quite often we've formed initial views which are completely changed by the site visit. The scales fall from our eyes, and the world opens up to us in terms of how we're going to frame our decisions. So site visits tend to be not accompanied these days, but if you are lucky enough to accompany an inspector on a site visit, be helpful, point out anything that you think might be useful when prompted by the inspector. But yeah, otherwise we do enjoy the site visit as well. Next slide, please, Lisa. Thank you. So for these types of appeals, please don't state opinions. Use objective evidence where possible, as we need to. Next point, please. And next point as well. Thanks very much. We'll always come back to policy and the evidence that you provide to us. So if necessary, if you've got a council design guide or a design SPD, which relates to isolated homes in the countryside, make reference to any points back on them. Likewise, make reference to any landscape guide or national character areas which come up. Next point, please. Next 2 points, please, Lisa. Thank you. And really useful in these sorts of design-based cases are design and access statements. They can be more useful than planning statements because we like to be told the story of how the schemes come about. The evolution of the design is really important to us. And if that can test the criteria of the policy in terms of how the designs evolve, that's very useful to us as well. Thank you. Next slide, please. We often get documents in which the entire first half is a regurgitation of policy. It's not useful to us. We don't actually get very long to go through information before we get to the site visit. We will have read everything, but it can be a stretch when we have a 200-page document or several 200-page documents for what can be, at first sight, a simple case. What is useful to us, and the next point, please, Lisa, is any precedent cases being submitted on what you're relying to. But again, a commentary is useful. So please don't just refer to previous appeals. Tell us why you're referring to them. That's useful. Thank you. Next point. This is an important one. We can't make assumptions when we're writing decisions. We can only make decisions based on what's given to us. So we can't come up with previous appeal decisions, for example. We can't use previous examples that we've dealt with, or refer back to previous cases that we've dealt with. So please do explain everything to us. Like I said previously, don't regurgitate policy, but use an analysis of the policy for us. If you're lucky enough to be dealing with one of these with us in a hearing or inquiry, and we ask you a question, please don't evade the question. It's not the way to get an inspector on side. And if you do ask to be submitted, if you are asked to submit a statement of common ground, next point, please, Lisa. They are welcomed by us, but the most effective ones narrow down the issues and are used as, well, they're more useful as statements of uncommon ground to us. Thank you very much. Following Braintree, whether homes are isolated following Braintree is often a matter of planning judgment. Whether or not the proposal accords with the development plan policies for the location of new housing is where we will start. So quite often we get binary opinions on the same thing. So when we're out on site visit, we'll look at the points that are pointed out to us, the location of bus stops, for example, local services, other dwellings around. We might get our boots on and walk any sort of public access routes that are suggested to us. But we'll always start and end, as I said, with the development plan policies. So next point, please. And next point as well, thanks. It will depend on the particular circumstances of the case. So again, we'll go back to the evidence, and the strength of the evidence will often determine the case. Thank you. So in conclusion, consider the information that you've given us in accordance with the NPPF and the criteria that you've given to us. Thank you. Paragraph 80 houses, 80E houses particularly, have a very high bar. Please don't ignore the development plan policies. We'll always end with whether or not the proposal accords with the development plan as a whole. And remember that the purpose of an appeal is to provide evidence necessary for the inspector to make a decision. If we need extra information, we'll ask you, but otherwise we rely on what we get from you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Glenn. We're now going to move on to the last presentation from Demystified, who's our design review panel manager. Demystified, you want to start your presentation, please?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, just want me a moment.
Do you want me to add the presentation, Demystified?
No, I don't know what. Sorry.
I can do it if you want me to, Demystified.
Right,
no
I've got
problem. You got it. Okay.
it. Sorry about that. Okay, so I'm Demystified. Can everybody see that okay now?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm Demystified. I'm the design review panel manager at Design Midlands, and we've reviewed, like Chris mentioned, over 100 of the Para 80 projects in the last 4 years, many of them coming back for a second, maybe third review. And my presentation is going to focus on the design tools that we use with the local authorities to support the assessment of Para 80 projects, what makes a successful Para 80 project, which we've covered to an extent, and what to look for in the DAS. So, Okay, so we offer 3 design tools for the assessment of Para 80 projects. So these are a walk and talk, design review, and a desktop design review. And for all of these, we put together a bespoke design review panel for the project with the skills and expertise to assess the scheme. This always is an architect and a landscape architect than any other disciplines that are relevant to the site. So, for example, conservation, heritage, sustainability. These design tools, we always want this to be a collaborative and constructive process. So it's the design team, the client, the panel, and the local authority. And it's always really useful to have the local authority there, because the planning officer has the knowledge of the site, the surrounding context, other planning applications, planning history, which is really valuable to the process. So with a walk and talk, this is when proposals are at the really early design stages. So we're looking at design principles. So this is when some site analysis and site studies have been undertaken, and the design team are filtering that, and they're looking at what should be the design principles. Design review is when the scheme's further developed, but still at a development stage. And this is usually 3, maybe 4 panel members, and it involves a briefing from the planning officer, a thorough site visit. We do site visits for walk and talk as well, a presentation from the design team, questions and comments from the panel, and then a summary. And then a letter is produced which goes through all the panel's comments and sent to everybody at the meeting. And then the desktop design review is for schemes, usually when they're close to being submitted for planning, and it's just refinements and minor amendments. So say at the last design review, it would have said, the letter would have said the scheme is considered to meet the criteria of paragraph 80E subject to. So it might be additional information or refining a small element of the scheme. So that's how we tend to get involved. So what makes a successful Para 80 project? We've gone through this in Chris and Gillian's presentations, but firstly is a dedicated client, someone who's really committed to the process, involved in the process, so very much a member of the design team, and has an understanding of the high bar that needs to be achieved but also has an affinity and a connection to the site. As Gillian mentioned, you can quite often easily spot out the ones who are looking at a Para 80 as a speculative development and those who really want to live on the site and be part of the site, and that to be part of their legacy. The right design team, experience and expertise, which we've already covered, a logical and considered design process, early engagement, I would say, both with the local authority and ourselves. Like I mentioned, we've got a range of design tools to support that. I think the earlier schemes come, the better it is. Working in collaboration. So this is not just members of the design team, so the landscape architect and the architect and the client working together, but it's also how you work with the local authority and that the local authority is part of that process. A scheme formed from in-depth understanding of site and context and compelling narrative and a carefully curated and informed design and access statement. So what to look for in the DAS? We've mentioned the importance of a vision and narrative, but this doesn't necessarily need to be reams of pages. We've found it just needs to be a simple and succinct statement or concept diagram which captures the spirit of the project. One of our panel members often refers to that this is a scheme that can only be on this site for this client and by this design team, and refining that to a simple statement really helps to understand what you are wanting to achieve and what is this project about. The client brief, why the clients want to undertake the project and how they want to live in the sites. Gillian mentioned the scheme earlier on about a multi-generational project. We had one recently, which was a family in Lincolnshire, where it's two sets of grandparents, the parents and the children. And what they produced is a diary of what each member of the family would do on each day. And then they superimposed that with a spider diagram showing where these activities would take place on the site and how that had informed the layout, both of the house, the internal layout and the landscape. So that was really compelling, but it was only like 2 or 3 pages, but really explained what they want, how they wanted to live on the site and how that their brief had informed the project. Comprehensive site analysis, site studies, which we've already covered, a set of well-defined drivers, principles drawn from the site analysis and the client brief. The site analysis is really important, but also how that analysis is filtered and the design drivers and how they draw on the character and identity of the site context and what the client in the client brief is really essential as well. A robust rationale for justification for design decisions taken, just referring back to Richard's drawing of plans of, you know, the positioning of a building within the site. Again, just really information just explaining what that process is and the rigour that's taken place for all those design decisions. A carefully curated and considered set of drawings and plans. They need to show the site within its wider context, not just the red line or blue line boundary. So how the site relates to other buildings, important views, landscape, topography, that all needs to be evidenced within the DAS. And a compelling and robust justification how the scheme meets the criteria of paragraph 80. Just saying it's exemplar or outstanding isn't enough. It's got to be backed up and really justified. And what else? One of our panel members always refers to this, outstanding doesn't mean stand out. So schemes don't have to say, look at me. The ones that sometimes sit really quietly within their context are the most successful. And again, schemes don't need to be hidden. Quite often we'll have schemes come to design review and they've positioned the house in a location or site where it can't be seen. Well, if the scheme's exemplar and the local typology is for buildings to be at the frontage of the sites. That should be a really key driver. So again, schemes don't need to be hidden. I've really whizzed through that very quickly because I'm really mindful of time. So hopefully that's been helpful.
Thank you, Demystified. Could we have the speakers now all put their cameras back on and join us, please? We have about 10 minutes left, and it's great to see that some of our speakers have commented on some of the questions that have been raised in the chat. I mean, there have been so many common threads raised through the webinar this morning, and I really hope that this will be useful to planning officers who are the majority of the audience here today. I think something I would like to reiterate really is that the design review panel is an advisory panel. We are a critical friend in the process, and I think in South Kesteven they're very fortunate to have the brilliance of Richard guiding them on their design story, but very often that isn't the case in some local authorities. So the Design Midlands panel is here to support that overall process, and you know, that telling that story and supporting design teams, because it is, as Gillian also pointed out, a huge, you know, feat, isn't it? A huge challenge to you know, to move a project like this forward. So John and Glenn, if you don't mind, you did respond to the question of design review panel report weight, and I think that's been really helpful, your response to that. But would you mind just sort of covering that again for us, because it's a question that we've had, you know, raised with us over the years?
Sure. John, do you want me to?
No, go on, you, Glenn.
Okay.
You go.
I was recently at an inquiry where the absence of design panel comments was raised by the council as a reason in their evidence. So I think it comes from both sides. The answer that I gave in the chat there was that we do need evidence on how the design panel relates to the council's decision-making process, because it's different in every case that we have. Sometimes it will be an informal panel, sometimes it will be made up of committee members as well, and it will report directly to the planning committee, and it will be given different amounts of weight in different councils as well. So we need to come to a judgment based on the information that we have, as I mentioned. If we don't have a link between the design panel and the council decision-making process, it will just be taken as another piece of third-party evidence. So it would be useful to know exactly what that link was and what the importance to the decision-making process is.
I think that's really, really helpful, because we do try very, very hard to be transparent and include the local authority, but you know, resources are, you know, really, really stretched, and very often a planner's time, particularly if there isn't sort of appropriate pre-app fee arrangements made and whatever to support the planning officer through that process, then it can be very challenging for them to engage every step of the way, which can be quite onerous and time consuming. So that's been really helpful.
Just on that, Julie, as well,
yes,
if I could
John,
just add that as we've already agreed this morning, the design is very much evolving here, and I think if the design panel can be shown that they've had an input into that evolution of the scheme, that's going to be very material with an inspector. He or she will look at the influence the review panels had on that. But that, as Glenn said earlier in his presentation, inspectors can only consider the appeal on the basis that the evidence that's before them. So all of that needs to be made clear, that the design review panel has influenced the evolution of the scheme.
Yeah, and from our perspective, we're also very strongly of the opinion that there needs to be panel continuity, strong disciplines engaged right from the outset, coming in very early, and very often the design review panel can give early advice at around about the same sort of time as a pre-app conversation that talks about what's proportionate on this site. Is your brief right? You know, before there's any sort of preemptive sort of work done from a design team, and the client needs to be fully engaged. It is, you know, it's there's quite a family of input on these Para 80s. It's not for the faint-hearted at all. Chris and Gillian, both practicing architects, have you any sort of contribution to make to this conversation at this stage?
Yeah, well, just noticed somebody asking the question about scale here. Do they have to be, you know, big, expensive? I mean, lots of them are, but no, you know, they don't need to be at all. So I think both Gillian and I were both making the point, but you know, the difference here is that the level of rigor that has to be applied to this process in putting together, you know, a design and submitting an application is the same. But I mean, they can be, and they are. We recently saw a fairly modest application for a 2-bed dwelling in the countryside, which is, you know, rather interesting. It's not the norm, but you know, that there's no rules about scale here.
And we have seen schemes brought to review where there's an Olympic-sized swimming pool in the garden, and the client really hasn't really completely understood the scale that that maybe their architect has put forward for them. So, you know, that there's as much support that a design review panel and the local authority can bring in supporting the client through this process, because, you know, it isn't for the faint-hearted. And anyway, Gillian, did you have anything you wanted to add on this? No. Oh, sorry.
Not specifically. No, I think I agree with what Chris has just said and what was said in the chat, that the process we have to go through is so rigorous that's where the cost lies, as well as the risk. So it tends to go with larger scale projects, but that's not a requirement. You know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Richard, anything you wanted to add from a local authority's perspective?
No, not particularly. No, I think just maybe to repeat what I said about, you know, local authority cannot objectively assess certain things. Use the really helpful advice from the panel to feed into that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Darmista, anything you'd like to add? I mean, I think we can always tell the quite cynically, we can always tell the scheme that is, you know, not wholly expected to be for the client, you know, where it is a speculative scheme. We can tell that straight away, and they're trying to use the design review panel to sort of, you know, get to where they want to be from an economic point of view. So, you know, it's yeah, it can be very challenging at times. Anything you want to add, Darmy, on that?
Just, I think for planning officers, you know, that their input is really valuable at design review. And, you know, we have a section where we ask the planning officer to do a briefing and to raise any issues that they want the panel to address. And that's not anything negative. It's just where they'd like the panel's input and comments. So it could be on a view, material palette, anything. But it's really important for us that we understand the issues that they're concerned with, because they've got member pressure, they've got pressures on other things that we're not necessarily aware of. So that really helps make sure that it is a constructive process for everybody that's involved. So we don't want them there just to come and listen. We want them to be part of the review and part of the meeting.
And I think for us, one of the frustrating things, because we do get engagement from some local authorities in the Midlands, but it's just on Para 80, you know, and there's a lot of design support is needed on a single dwelling for a single family or extended family. But if you imagine the rigor that we put into a Para 80 scheme, just imagine the benefits that would come from looking at a large urban extension or housing development or regeneration scheme. Yes, Gillian.
Funny enough, I was just going to touch on that, because we haven't really talked a lot about supporting, improving the quality of design in rural areas in today's session. And we were asked by, after our first project was approved, we were asked by our local authority to do a workshop with the planning committee to talk about the mystiquery around design quality and what looks good and how does all that work. And it expanded out into how almost, you know, how to look at a drawing and know whether it's actually factually correct, and to have confidence that somebody's not trying to fudge something, or, you know, it was quite a wide-ranging discussion, but they were really keen that the planning committee learned from the project that we'd done to try and influence exactly what you've just said about how to bring those sorts of criteria into judging other projects where the design quality isn't perhaps quite so high on the agenda.
And I think it's really useful that Richard did touch on the National Design Guide, because you get so blinkered really with para 80s that you do come right down to the fine detail, don't you? But actually there is, you know, we do have a wealth of advice out there. And you know, our role and purpose is to make this as objective as possible, as proportionate as possible, and as realistic as possible as well in supporting, you know, in supporting people in this work, not only in para 80s, as I mentioned, but, you know, and wider development proposals as well. So I'm going to conclude now. Thank you ever so much, everybody. It's absolutely been terrific. And I can tell you've put a lot of time and effort into preparing this for us today. We will be adding this recording as a learning resource to Design Midlands and EMC's websites, and the presentations will be PDF'd and made available as well. So please do use them. Do get in touch. You know, the Design Midlands is a design review panel. We are a charity based in the Midlands, and do get in touch and talk to us about any sort of queries you might have on design support or anything else. We are here as a resource for you, and we are here to support the planning process and ensure we have great places to live in the Midlands. So thank you very much to Lisa, who's been behind the scenes making the magic happen. And yes, hopefully see you at the next webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.